Okay, we might begin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the BCS workshop, Legal 101 for Biotech. I'm Mayura from Biotech Connection Singapore, and I'll be a moderator for this webinar. In the next hour, we'll be discussing part one of the legal workshop series, which is legal agreements in early stage biotech. So thank you for joining us today on your lunch break on a Friday. For those who are not familiar with BCS, we are a non-profit organization in Singapore with a mission to promote entrepreneurship across all areas of healthcare. And one way we do this is by hosting a series of workshops where we bring in experts to discuss different aspects of startups and entrepreneurship. In this Legal 101 series, we will be exploring a very fundamental aspect of life science business, and that is legal agreements, which are crucial in not just starting and running, but also growing biotech companies. To explain and demystify some of these legal agreements, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Lila Hope, partner at Cooley Law Firm, who will be our speaker for this series. So I'll just introduce Lila and Cooley as well. Lila has represented multiple life science companies across drug discovery and development, vaccines, medical devices, diagnostics, and digital health products, so a vast range of expertise. She specializes in transactions involving complex IP, business, operational, and legal issues, and has helped her clients on licensing, supply, distribution, clinical trials, research collaborations, and vendor service agreements. She has also been involved in over 20 IPOs and has been active in the Asian biotech scene with over 18 transactions in the last 5 years. So I'd just like to introduce Cooley as well. Cooley is currently in its 100th year. It's a premier law firm for tech and life science companies with over 1,000 lawyers across 16 offices. The firm closes over 1,000 venture deals per year and has been consistently ranked #1 firm for global licensing, IPO, and financing transactions for life sciences and healthcare companies. Cooley Singapore was in fact launched earlier this year in 2020. And they are able to advise on a full range of corporate matters. And today we also have joined with us some of the Cooley Singapore lawyers as well. So with that, I'd just like to welcome Lila and everyone from Cooley to this webinar.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So before we begin, we'd just like to do a short poll in terms of, to understand how the different backgrounds from everyone. And who is attending with and participating in this webinar today. So we can make sure it's as interactive as possible and suits your, tailored to your needs. So if we could launch the first poll. Yep, so please tell us, what is the most relevant background for you so we can get an idea. Okay, great. So we can see that we actually have a pretty good spread. Mostly in the biotech and medtech sector, but also people from academia, those who've been scientific founders, and pharma and legal backgrounds as well. Great. Okay, so thanks for doing the poll, everyone. So the way this workshop series will run is that Lila has some slides, and she will explain and go through some different types of legal agreements and that early biotechs need. And we will have a short discussion for each agreement after it's presented. So please do add in your questions into the Q&A section. And at the end of the presentation, we will also have some dedicated time to answer any other questions. So with that, I will hand over to Lila and we will go through, start the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mayura, and thank you for BCS for inviting me today. I will wait for the slide presentation to come up, but in the meantime, I just want to say a few words. I actually grew up in China, so I speak Mandarin Chinese and came to the US to study in 1990. And I actually did a biology PhD in cancer biology before realizing that I am just not very good at bench work. So went to law school and have been practicing law in the biotech space for the last 18 years, all at Cooley. So I think I love the area. I love working with biotech clients, mostly because I speak the language. I can actually watch all the innovative technology coming out of the biotech space and academia without actually having to do the bench work and make it work myself. You know, I learned just as much from my biotech clients as about science and new technology as they learn from me about how to do deals and do legal work. So I'm just really happy to be speaking with all of you and try to answer as many questions as I can today, or even after today's presentation. So if we just go to the first slide, I think as I suppose second slide. So I think Cooley is a worldwide firm. We have over 1,100 lawyers where we have offices in US, Europe, and Asia. Singapore is our newest office, but really is the coolest place with really wonderful people having ages of experience practicing law in Asia, in Singapore, and from the US as well. Cooley's probably the two big legs that Cooley is standing on are biotech and technology, and anywhere in between, which is the crossover of technology and medicine, which I think today is just really an exciting field. We have clients in over 90 countries, and we represent over 50% of the biotech companies on NASDAQ index. Next slide, please. This is our little shameless promotion. Really, biotech is in our DNA, so to speak, and we do probably more deals in the biotech space and have more clients in the biotech space than anyone else. That's, I think, partly because we started serving biotech clients very early on, back in the times of Genentech and Amgen. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge, and the firm also built out practices such as patents, regulatory compliance, privacy, basically, to supplement, all of areas of the needs for biotech clients. Next slide, please. So what I'm really psyched about is working with startup companies and emerging companies and biotech companies. Why is that? Because it's just full of hopes and dreams and a lot of potential, and it's really the most interesting part of starting a business. I think it's the time when you put in a lot of thoughts and put the company onto just the right path. And those initial times when you think about the company and how you start up, what you focus on, and what is your strategy, actually really just maps out the blueprint of the company and have really fundamental impact on how successful the company would be in the future. So it's a really critical period and very, very exciting. So you want to start a company, what do you think about, right? So first of all, you have some IP and product concept. You're starting a company to do something, to make something. Is it a medical device? It is a diagnostic. Sometimes it's not so clear. Is it a consumer product? Is it a food? Is it a supplement? Or is it a drug, right? So what it is that you're doing? And from the IP perspective, what do you have that's different from anyone else's? What can help you be actually the company that differentiates yourself from everybody else? That goes, so the IP analysis goes in two parts. One is, okay, so what do I have that nobody else has that would exclude others from the marketplace and make me a different player in the marketplace? And the second analysis is, what do other people have that I might need in order to build up my product, to configure my product, and make sure that I don't have a freedom to operate issue or infringe other people's IP or misappropriate anyone else's trade secret. So those two are really two fundamental elements of analyzing what is the IP landscape and IP strategy of the company. Just to have a product and an idea and some IP coverage really is necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to be successful in the startup world. I think one important thing that folks think about, and we all need to kind of stop and think about, especially for us who have been scientists before, because we're so excited about a scientific idea and just a really elegant solution to something, is to think about what is the path to commercial viability. And this is partly because, part of the objective of the company is to make great products, to sell great product, but part of the objective of the company is also to be able to survive. And in order to survive as a company, you need to attract investors, get funding, and become commercially viable, right? So I think what goes into that consideration is, what am I finally making? What am I finally building? And what is the regulatory pathway? How do I get there? Is this the first product of the type on the market, or is it one of many? How do I position myself? Is this a first in class, best in class, or do I need to compete with other standard of care and other treatment that had already been approved? What is the marketplace? What's the competitive landscape? And how profitable can I be? If I have to price my product, if I have a really wonderful product, but nobody is going to pay more than $50 for it, then am I going to actually become profitable? And will I be able to attract investors in order to make my business, in order to get off the ground? And the third part is the team. Who will be involved and in what capacity? Who is, I need scientists on the team who will be giving input to the product. I need folks that are good from a business sense to be able to kind of, do the budgeting and do the financials and being able to relate to the investors and so on and so forth. And I may need folks who have experience in terms of logistics, project management, or basically alliances with other companies and collaborative activities and so forth. You may not need everybody up front, but it's important to think who are the key people to get moving with the company and who you might need along the way. And whether they are coming in as founders, employees, consultants, or advisors. We're going to get a little bit more into that into the presentation as to if I want to start a company and what role do I play. Funding, how much do I need? Who do I take it from? Do I need just some friends and family money to get off the ground? Or do I just go out and basically take in a financing from a VC fund that's multiple millions of dollars? There's pros and cons of both, right? We all know it's very tricky and sometimes stressful to bootstrap, but sometimes bootstrapping allow you to move the concept into and incubate a little bit so that people can actually see what shape it will take and what potential it may have, and you may solve a number of basically initial hurdles and prove the concept a little bit more, and that will maybe attract the investors and help the company get a better valuation. So it's very case by case, and I think myself and my colleagues in the Singapore office, because we've worked with so many startup companies, we're very happy to chat with it about any of these concepts to say, okay, let's just talk about it. We're not here just to do a deal, but we're here to chat with you about, you've got an idea. How do we get this idea from this? How can we get this from idea to something that could look like a product and get funding and help you realize the startup dream? So next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a biotech timeline. I think it's overly simplified, and obviously for each practice area, medtech versus devices versus diagnostics and pharma is a little bit different. But I think overall is a good representation as to what you need. There's a discovery and preclinical study stage, and there's clinical development when you actually apply your technology and drug and products to humans and try to come up with results. And then you also eventually, hopefully, when it's successful, you'll have whatever approval or you need in order to commercialize the product. And the gray boxes on this slide actually show what outside interaction you may have, right? What you do outside the company. So these are the places where, basically you would enter into agreement with another party. And this is where, basically where I come in to help and try to add some value. So as the very beginning, that you can either come up with a technology in your garage, in which case you have the technology, it's yours, it doesn't belong to anyone else. Or you can, basically identify some technology that's in a university setting. It could be something that came out of your own lab. It could be something that, if you are a serial entrepreneur just looking on the market for the next, startup idea, you could, kind of hear about a really interesting technology that's coming out of the lab of a university, and you could go and get a license, right? The initial technology could be it could be grown in-house, or it could be in license from someone else. And when you have a small team initially, it's very likely that you're not going to be doing everything by yourself. So when you can't do everything yourself, you reach out and collaborate with others, and that comes in different flavors. You could be entering into a sponsored research agreement with a university where the idea and invention originated anyway, and they would be really the experts in the field. You could say, okay, I will license your technology, and I will also sponsor research there so that I can get access to, I can direct the research a little bit in, improving the technology or coming up with some alternatives, and I will have access to the technology that comes out of that research. Or you could say, oh, I have one side of the equation and somebody else, another biotech company, has another side. Let's put the two together and see what we can combine the technology and do something about that. Or you can, enter into a vendor agreement and basically engage a service provider to say, oh, I have everybody I need, but I don't have a medicinal chemist in-house. So I'm gonna partner or, engage a med chem company for them to do medicinal chemistry for me, and I will basically, it's a fee for service arrangement. So there are many of those. So we're going to go through some of those. I'll just give you a quick introduction for all of them today. And I will save the corporate partnering and product collaborations for the next talk, because that's a whole topic of its own, and it really is the hallmark of a successful product at a point where basically essentially you're doing a strategic partnering deal, as many biotechs tend to do. Next slide, please.
Lila, before we, I guess, go into the specifics of the agreements, I think you've done a great job summarizing all the different agreements that are required. Perhaps we can also get an idea from the audience of the different sectors that they're in currently. So potentially drug discovery, or versus digital, or medtech, or diagnostics. So we actually have a poll to get an idea from our audience. So we'll just launch that so you get an idea of what areas it is that our audience is really hoping to listen to today. Okay, great. Very
That's
even.
a pretty even split. Yes. Well, I'm going to try to do my best to cover the different areas if there are nuances, but obviously if we can't cover everything, I will stay a little longer and answer any questions that folks might have.
Yeah, and if any of you have any questions, please do put them into the Q&A.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so the licenses, right? So this is the fundamental, most of the time it's the first deal that a biotech company does, which is the in-license technology. So I want to just mention that there are different elements of a license. A typical license grant is copied here. So licensor, which is the university, institution, whoever owns the patent, would grant to licensee a license. And here we ask, is it an exclusive license versus a non-exclusive license? Exclusive license just means that basically you're the only person in the world who can practice this license. And once the licensor grants you the license, they cannot give the right to anybody else. A non-exclusive license basically means, the licensor can give it out to as many people as they want. With the right to grant sub-licenses, can you actually pass on the license to someone you're working with and your collaborators and your partners? That's a sub-license. And what is the scope of the license grant? It's under the license patent. So you need to define what is the set of patents that's subject to the license. And license know-how, these are the materials, information, data, results, whatever that's non-patentable inventions or unpatented inventions, what these are that actually is being granted, the rights is being granted to you. And what can you do with it? Typically it's research, develop, make, have made. Have made just means engage someone else to make it. Use, sell, offer for sale, import and export, all the things that you can do for the product. And what is the product, right? Sometimes a licensed patent is really broad, like the recombinant DNA patent. When it's granted to you, the license is basically for you to make whatever product that you're making in your company. And if it's especially if it's a platform patent or if it's a research tool patent, it really is, you need to define it as to what's the scope of the products that you're making it. Is it cell therapy only? Is it a particular type of antibodies, or is it a small molecule? So what that is. In the licensed field, this could be sometimes just the therapeutic field, sometimes it's diagnostics, sometimes it's prevention, sometimes it's humans, sometimes it's animals, and sometimes it's just the infectious diseases versus oncology, right? What is the field of use that you can do? And in the licensed territory, is it a Singapore only deal? Is it an Asian deal? Is it a worldwide deal? And you can carve that out in so many different ways. So as a licensee, when you take the license, typically you have many obligations in the license agreement, because every sentence that starts with a licensee shall is an obligation for the licensee. But probably the two most important obligations is to make payments and to use diligent effort to exploit the technology. So the payment obligation is typically split up as upfront milestone royalties, sublicense revenue, which a lot of times it's not in every agreement, but in university license agreement, it's quite common. And it's much less common if it's biotech to biotech or biotech to pharma. And a lot of times the university wants you to reimburse them for past patent costs when you sign on as an exclusive licensee. And sometimes the first license you take from the university, because you're a small company, they're licensing it to you for relatively small upfront money. But in addition, they would like to take an equity stake in the company, because they want to invest in your success, and that's in exchange for basically licensing you the technology relatively cheap upfront. So that's another component of it. The other obligation that you have is to diligently pursue the product opportunity. What does that mean? That means you need to use commercially reasonable efforts, or you need to use diligent efforts, or you need to always be developing the technology. What it is, that it comes in all kinds of different flavors. Basically, what the licensor is saying is, for as long as you're using my technology, you have the license. But if you stop using it and shelving it, that means I'm not going to derive any of the downstream benefits from you anymore, because you stopped working on it, and in which case you need to give it back to me. And that's highly negotiated, because we don't want this to be tripped over too easily, that if you are just pausing and thinking, then all of a sudden you are deemed not diligent and the license will be terminated. But obviously this is just a highly negotiated point, and sometimes people need to take time to evaluate different options, and that is completely within the realm of reason. So what are the rights of a licensee? When you have a license, you actually have two layers of rights. One is to practice the technology. If someone else has a patent without a license, you actually, if you are selling a product that's covered by the patent, you're infringing. So part of the rights of a licensee is to actually have the right to practice the technology. So that's number one, without being sued by the patent owner. But a very important point of the rights of a licensee, especially if you're an exclusive licensee, is to the right to exclude others. Because now, instead of the licensor, instead of the patent owner being able to exclude anybody, now it's you who has the exclusive right to practice this patent, and it is you who have the right to exclude others from practicing the same technology. So that's, I think, a very important point when you go in and negotiate the license agreement, is to have the right to enforce the patents upon other folks who might be infringing.
And Lila, there was a question from one of the attendees about how to negotiate an exclusive license deal with the university to develop a new product. Maybe you could touch on that for a minute.
Yeah, so I can do that. And we have, Matt, actually a set of questions that we collected for each of the slides. So we may, for the audience questions, maybe we can save them towards the end. But I'll just mention this one. I think typically with universities, the tech transfer office their job is to commercialize the technology, right? So what they do is, you know, I think a lot of times the founders would go in and just approach the university and say, hey, I am interested in this technology. And the university could be either running an auction with a lot of bidders, or the university could say, okay, nobody's interested, so let's negotiate terms without me going out and try to shop the patent. And then what you do is to kind of understand what's the scope of the license you have and come up with a set of proposals as to what's the economic terms. The startup could be proposing the first set of terms, so the university may propose the first set of terms. And we have some comps, and that's really very, very dependent on what is the technology, whether it's exclusive, what's the product, what's the market. And the upfront money is typically not very big, but the milestones are going to be very much tied to the stages of the development of the product. That's why you need to kind of know what is your product timeline. And the royalty rates are typically very much dependent on how mature the technology is and what other things you have to add to it in order to make it a successful product. If this is the lead drug, you can just go in and do some studies or some in vitro studies and then immediately go into clinic with it. It's one thing. If it's a discovery technology and you still have to use it in order to come up with you don't even have a target or a product yet. You have to go figure out your own target or product. Or if it's just one element of a cell therapy and you have to in-license technology from 10 different people in order to put your cell therapy together, all of those goes into the consideration as to how much payment burden you can take on from one particular, for one particular technology, because they all add up. So I think, so once you have that and get through the kind of initial stage to say, okay, I have some meeting of the mind as to what's the scope of the license and what I'm paying for. Then we get into sometimes a term sheet and sometimes just, straight into a license agreement. And a lot of times the university, they have their own forms. So they're going to give it to us, give it to you, and then, we'll help you look through that and try to push back on certain points. And I think the universities typically have some very, kind of standard issues that they, as some of these laid out here, and publication rights and retained rights and all of that. So I think we can work through that and we negotiate and we get there. If you're not ready to go in and negotiate a full-blown license, because a lot of people say, oh, I'm starting a company, I have this idea, I want to know I have this technology, but I also know that I can raise money on it. A lot of times you go in and negotiate an option agreement before a license agreement. You go in and put down a small amount of money, a couple $1,000, $5,000, or even less than that, and say, okay, I want an exclusive option. What that says is, can you reserve this technology for me? Can you please not give it to somebody else for 6 months or 12 months? And while I have this piece of paper in my hand to say that this technology is reserved for you, I can go talk to some investors and say, hey, look, I have the exclusive reservation for this technology, exclusive option. Can you, would you like to invest? This is my business plan. And that's when you start, when you try to parallel process the fundraising and the license negotiation. Once you get a term sheet from some investors to say, we're going to invest, you trigger the option, you exercise the option, you trigger the license negotiation. And at the end of the day, they all come together at the same time when you, so that you can execute the license at the same time that you get funding. And, you have a place where people write you a check to pay the upfront payment, but you also know that the university also knows that, you have a backer so that they're licensing the technology to someone. So that's a super good question, Matt. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Lila, there's also, we had one of these questions prepared, but in terms of the percentages of, royalties or specific numbers, is there generally a consensus around, depending on the stage of the product development or perhaps market size? What are some of the other, you mentioned like combination products, whether you need something else to license, to commercialize is important. But are there like specific, amounts that people should be sort of looking for when they look at a license agreement?
So if a license agreement, if the license is from, so it depends, right? You could be licensing a technology from the university. That's very kind of early stage. Mm-hmm. I typically would advise people to say never go above 2 to 4%, right? You could be even lower than 2 if it's just really a very, very basic technology, but typically the university is looking for something that's around 2 to 4%. Then that's not, just that number is not all the magic, right? You want to lay in different layers to say, oh, if I have to in-license 5 million other technologies in order to make this work, where I can kind of basically reduce my royalty burden or my, to you a little bit in order to make this all work, in order to make my numbers work. So that's one important piece. And another important piece is if you actually have a sponsor research agreement with the university and you continue to sponsor research and continue to in-license technology from the university, what do, right? Do they get added to the same license? Typically not. And then you all of a sudden you're entering into additional license agreements with the university, and they all add up together, and maybe they speak to different technology, or maybe they speak to the same product. So I think all of those is part of the planning, and it's very case by case to say, okay, how much can I take as a royalty burden from this one particular technology? That being said, a lot of people start a company where their first product is actually a phase 2 product that's parked by a pharma. If a pharma basically says, well, this product is good, but it's not good enough for me, it didn't kind of meet my internal go, no-go criteria. But as a biotech, you could say, oh yeah, that is a great product. I want to start a company with that, right? And sometimes people coming out of pharma, because it's a canned, project, or, because their project got stopped, they say, I still believe in the product. I want to start a company and work on it. And that, from that perspective, the royalty rate tends to be a little higher because you have a lead product, it has been clinically proven, and so on and so forth. So we can get into that, but that tends to be in higher single digits, or maybe sometimes even lower double digits, low teens, right? It really depends on which stage of development the product is in.
Mm-hmm. Great. And in terms of, there's also some questions on non-exclusive licenses. So generally,
Yes.
what kind of technologies are given as a non-exclusive license versus exclusive? And are there any differences in sort of the terms?
Yes, the non-exclusive licenses are typically cheaper, as you would expect. But what it is if you want an exclusive license, if basically the patent rights are essentially the ones that give you product exclusivity. For example, if you're in licensing a drug, a small molecule or antibody, and it's a composition of matter patent, you want an exclusive license. Why? Because you don't want other people to be going out and selling the same drug. If it's a discovery tool or a research tool, sometimes it would be okay to get a non-exclusive license because I get to use CRISPR or I get to use the recombinant DNA technology, but my goal is not to exclude other people to use it for their own research, right? But even for the research tool, sometimes it may be beneficial to have an exclusive license for your particular field. For example, I can say that, oh, there's a really neat technology for cell culture, and I want to be the world predominant cell therapy company. So there's this thing that's great for cell culture, and it's fine if you can grant licenses to other people for cell culture use, but I want the exclusive right in my field, in my license field, which is for doing cell therapy, autologous, whatever, you name it, right? So I think that's where you basically say, what do I actually need and what do I actually get? Do I, and it's a very case by case analysis again. At some level, you want out of your entire patent platform to have something that gives you exclusivity. So if you have a discovery tool, even though that's not exclusive, the moment you discover a target and the drug to it, you'll file composition of matter patents, and that's the patent you're going to rely on for your market exclusivity. That's why it's not so critical to have the research tool license be exclusive. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear the distinction. Yeah. So in terms of, I think we were also wondering in terms of what happens before the license agreement is signed, right? So what is the due diligence process like? Do you, tend to look through the IP of that you're going to license? And then does there even have to be a patent? What happens if it's not?
Yeah.
Do you use a know-how or trade secret?
Yeah, so with the patent, I think a lot of times since people in-license the technology already know about the technology, and it's something that they worked in the lab on, or they are very familiar with the scientific founder, and the scientific founder is a founder of the company. So typically the due diligence isn't that hard because they actually know the technology. If it's a, you're in licensing something from a pharma, obviously you have to do your analysis, both from the perspective of what's the patent coverage, is the patent good enough, is the patent good, right? So you could have a patent, but maybe that patent at the end of the day is not going to hold up because they're prior arts or whatever, something out there. And two is, what's my freedom to operate? Can I, so this patent sounds great, I'll in-license it, but oops, when I in-license in a startup, my company, and start configuring my product, I realize I need five other licenses in order to make this work, because other people have used patents or other things on this. So that's part of the diligence. As to patents versus know-how, that's another interesting question. It really depends on whether you need the data, the materials, the cell line. Sometimes the license is the database, right? We have the data we have to use patents. Sometimes, a lot of times, if you go to MD Anderson, they have a huge patient database. You may just want to license the use of some of the database in order to do, your discovery. And that is not a patent. And, but sometimes you have a drug that's being developed, or a lead compound or something, or antibody being discovered in the lab. You really just need the patent license, because you don't necessarily, the manufacturing cell line is going to be very different from the cell line that you have in the laboratory. The data can all be regenerated, right? Because all of that are preliminary, and they're probably not GLP, and you can't use them in whatever anyway. And if you in-license the know-how, then all of a sudden you owe the university not only money on products that the patents cover, but also products that touch the know-how. So in some ways, you make the things really complex as to what product is royalty bearing. If you just have a patent license, it's very clear cut, right? Either it's covered by your patent, or if I actually engineered away from your patent, then I don't have to pay anymore. But if you engineered away from the patent, but use the know-how that you licensed, then it's likely royalty bearing. So I think it's just an analysis as to, do you need it? If you don't need it, don't take it. If you need it, then take it.
Yeah. So better to go with patent licenses.
Yeah, but it's just an analysis, right? If there's a cell line that's just absolutely amazing, or an assay, or a animal model, for example, a knockout mice back in the days when I was in the lab, and nobody else has it, maybe you need that know-how license, but not everyone does.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we might just move on to the next.
Yeah, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so I think we already touched on the sponsor research with the university, right? So basically, you sponsor research in a laboratory. Many of you are in the academic setting, so you already know what all about this. The biotech, the rights would be to use data, to license the IP that's generated, or have an option to license the IP that's generated, to review publications, because the university always want to preserve the right to publish. But the biotech, because you're sponsoring the research before the university announces to everybody, you want to be able to review what they want to say, either in a manuscript or in a presentation, and maybe scramble to file some IP before the data is out there. So university always want to retain the right to use the new discovery for research purposes. And here it's also a highly negotiated point. What's the scope? Is it just internal, or is it collaborating with other universities? Is it collaborating with other nonprofits? And that could be the Gates Foundation. And does it include sponsor research for other pharmas, and to be able to use the same technology? Again, just a lot of things to think about, even though this is a very simple agreement.
Mm-hmm. So in these type of agreements, if the biotech wants university to do a certain part of their research, what happens in terms of the IP that's generated from that? So is it completely belong to the university, or can the people from the biotech be listed as inventors, or
yeah, that's a really good question. It really depends, right? Because as many of you probably know, as people who have inventors yourselves, the inventorship analysis is very much a patent law based analysis. You don't get to contract away inventorship. You don't get to say, okay, let's do this experiment together, and let's agree that no matter what our contributions are, at the end of the day, I will be the inventor and you're not the inventor. We can't contract that away, right? So what you can contract away is ownership of the patents, but not the inventorship. So a lot of times, if the company and if biotech and university are working together, and it's very common for there to be joint inventions, then the biotech will be likely half owner and the university will be half owner of that invention. If the biotech basically says, look, Dr. So-and-so, you are expert in this field. I'm just going to give you money, you do whatever you want. And the biotech never really rise to the level of inventorship in terms of their contribution. Then the university may solely own the patents. And that's why the biotech, when you sponsor research, you want to have a hook to say, okay, I have an option. I have an automatic non-exclusive license, but I have the option to get an exclusive license. Or I have nothing from day one, but I just have an exclusive option to come in, and I'm the first in line to get the technology if I want to. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Also, in terms of the sponsored research agreement, are the milestones sort of tranched, and is the funding dependent on how the research pans out? Do you have certain terms which can take care of that?
So sponsored research typically don't have milestone payment in my experience, but what it is, but it could be staged, right? So typically with the university and the faculty, you want to know, okay, I've got X million dollars or X hundred thousands of dollars in the next whatever month. So I know I can put someone on it, and I'm not going to, this project is going to go for a period of time. But as a biotech, you don't want to commit to funding a 3-year research of $3 million when you actually don't know what the results are going to show. So you may tranche it to say, okay, this is step 1. For step 1, we're going to fund this. At the end of step 1, we're going to do an evaluation, and if so, then I'll fund step 2, right? So, and that money could come in either as a lump sum for each step, or it could come on a monthly or quarterly basis based on a budget, and that's all negotiated.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. I think some of the questions we have are relatively technical, maybe not directly related to sponsored research. So maybe we can move on to the next agreement. So research collaboration, this is actually really neat, right? Because I think even as a lot of people think, okay, I'm too small to do a deal. Nobody is too small to do a deal. And sometimes you can even do a deal with a pharma company and have them fund your platform development. I have I have a client who is a spin out of a pharma company. It got an initial investment from the VC, not so much money. But what it's been doing is to be able to do deals with other pharma company who actually really loves its technology. And in doing so, it's doing research collaborations with pharmas and getting money developing its own platform and bringing product possibilities to the pharma. And other options are, you can say, okay, so I've got this amazing, drug that's potentially a treatment for something in the eye. In the eyes, I'm just making this up. And somebody else that a buddy of yours next door, actually have a really awesome technology for delivery. And then you can do a research collaboration to say, how can I put the two together? Is it going to work together? Is it all going to collapse into a huge chunk of basically settlement, or is it actually going to manage? And those are just collaborations. There's nothing, there's nothing, it's never too early to do a research collaboration. And this is different because this is when both parties have something to bring to the table. So it's different from the sponsor research or any services agreement, because it's not like I say, I'll pay you some money and you do what I tell you to do. This is the creativity of both parties, and a lot of times with the biotech, both parties' platform technology and being put in play. So who does what and who pays is really important. And the results are generally shared because both parties want to use the results to inform their internal R&D, which is to say, okay, now I know once I put these two together, it just precipitates. So I'll never use it with something that's similar to that again. And that's the result you want to be able to use and to direct your internal R&D no matter what. And I think what's also important is to say what happens if something works and what happens if something doesn't work. If something works, who gets to commercialize the results? Who is the party that takes it forward? Or do we negotiate? A lot of times it's, we negotiate a more comprehensive agreement to go forward together. When it works and something comes out, the new IP would be, some of it would be improvement to one party's platform, the other party's platform, or some of it could be the joint, right? It could be the two platforms joined together, and that's what you do. And then, who can use the IP for what is also a critical point. If it doesn't work, then what happens, right? Am I being blocked?
So one thing that sometimes we negotiate is to say nobody file any patents on this if we decide not to go forward, so that we don't generate a whole bunch of blocking IP that we could potentially block each other. Or you could say, well, it didn't work because we don't want to go forward together, but the IP is valuable, so let's file it and jointly own it, so that the two of us can, basically have ownership of new IP that's generated. And I think there's just again, this is one that's really interesting because no two deals look the same. No two deals even look similar, because the platforms are just, so unique in a way, and it's very, very interesting to negotiate.
Yeah. There's a question that's come in terms of, what should we do for, what should we look out for in terms of dispute resolution from an RCA perspective?
Dispute resolution. So it depends on what type of dispute, right? So if it is about how to conduct the experiment and how that typically is worked out between the parties. If one party, I think because it's both parties' platform, everyone wants to have a say in how his or her platform is used. And typically you require some agreement on the research plan before you can do it. If the dispute is about, I was supposed to do the work and you were supposed to pay me half of my costs, that is a dispute that's outside the realm of the company, and typically we handle it either with arbitration or mediation or something like that, or some kind of escalation. Or sometimes it's we try to draft the agreement in a way that it's not subject to such disputes. I think you'll be in a really awkward situation if the parties decide not to go forward and one party solely owns the IP and the IP is claimed broadly the other party's platform in combination with something, and the other party can't go forward even if it's trying to work with a third party. But that's part of, and that's a really sticky dispute, and I don't even know if there's a good solution to that, because it's just the outcome. You're unhappy with the outcome, but it is what it is because the contract doesn't say it. That's why we draft these contracts very carefully to avoid a situation like that from happening.
Yeah, makes sense. So in terms of, you said that both parties could potentially share IP ownership. Mm-hmm. So who gets the right to commercialize the product or the combined product?
And that's what you talk about ahead of time, right? Which is to say, okay, it's almost like, I have the land, you build the house, and who gets to live in it? And you talk about that ahead of time before the house is built. So that's that. If you jointly own, just from going back, but that's a contract matter, right? So just going back to about joint ownership, if you actually jointly own patents in certain jurisdictions, each owner can go out and basically practice the patents without the other party's consent or without paying that anything. But in some jurisdictions, Japan is one of them, some European countries are some of them, you actually can't. You have to require the consent of the other party in order to practice a joint patent. So you kind of have to contract it ahead of time. Sometimes people say, okay, we have a joint patent, that's cool, we can each benefit from it, let's just go out and do it. And sometimes people say, I actually don't want you to practice the joint patent without my consent, because, and that's vice versa. We may have a kind of a standstill situation because the joint patent gets a little too close to my own platform. And in that case, maybe it's better to just not file the joint patent rather than having blocking IP out there. So it's a bit case by case as well. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Great. I think we might just move on to the next.
Yeah, let's move on. Okay, so now you've got the technology. What do you do with your people? So I'm just going to touch on this a little bit because this is very jurisdiction specific, and I'm not proficient in Singapore employment law, but typically you hire people who are employees full-time, part-time, and you also have consultants and you also have advisors. So what's the difference, right? So typically an employee is someone who, the compensation is probably the big differentiator between employee and the other folks. And as an employee, you not only get your salary, but there may be requirements for you to get benefits. Stock option actually applies to everybody. And how do you differentiate between a consultant and advisor? I tend to think of the consultants as hired guns. So basically, a consultant is a little bit like an individual service provider. You go to, for example, you come to me and say, hey, Lila, can you do a presentation? Here's a loaf of bread. And I come and I do a presentation and there's a loaf of bread and I say, hey, I created this presentation for you and therefore you can have it. That's more of a consultant kind of a relationship. Advisor is someone you want to pick their brain. You don't tell them what to do, right? So the scientific advisors tend to be key opinion leaders, or they tend to be really experts in the field, really prominent professors. They are scientific advisors and they are on a scientific advisory board typically of anywhere between 5 to 10 people. And they have annual meetings or semi-annual meetings and they come together and they just brainstorm. And those people just pour out ideas for you and kind of, direct your company. Those are not the people that you say, I just tend to think the scientific advisors are probably just more prestige. And then, and then they also probably, it's more of a free-flowing thing. You actually don't want to be directing that work versus consultants. Since you pay them for their services, you want to be very, very concise as to this is what I want you to work on. This is what I want you to do. Rights to inventions, typically you want to have rights to the inventions of all these people who generate inventions in the capacity of their employment, consultancy, and advisory role. Sometimes there is a little bit of a gray zone if these folks are, for example, consultants, advisors could also be academic, professors, faculty, and they do work that's similar in their laboratory. So very much what you have to be able to differentiate which hat they're wearing when they generated the invention and whether the invention was generated using the laboratory equipment and facilities and funding, right? So, so that I think, before you go into this, you have to really work that out with them and make sure everyone is disciplined, because what you don't want to get into is a place where you thought you hired some consultants and got all of their services, but in reality, they are basically serving two masters, and all of a sudden you have a contradiction. And sometimes the university guidelines and policies will really direct how much consultancy and advisory role a faculty can be doing, and what's the IP ownership and allocation and analysis. So you need to take that into consideration as well, and it's sometimes case by case. I think I had already mentioned everything.
In terms of
sorry, the last one is really important. When someone is coming in and they were employees or consultants, they were employees of another company, you hired them over, it's really, really important to make sure that you have them document what are the past inventions that they had with their prior employers, and make sure that they know that even though they're trying to be helpful, they're not using it in your company. Sometimes people travel with an ice box, or sometimes people travel around with a thumb drive, and and even though they are needing to help with your startup, you need to be very careful that if those are not, if those rights belong to a prior employer or belong to the university, you don't use it, because then you get into these big cases like of trade secret misappropriation and so on and so forth. And you really just want to make sure that everything is clean. Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. Just a question that's come in is in terms of the SAB. So first is, when should you set one up if you need one? And secondly, in terms of the advisors as well, if they're coming from a very expert area that is applicable to your technology, in terms of the IP, are they, usually disputes, or in case of, how do you differentiate the IP that belongs to them, that's part of their research versus what they contribute that you can use in your company?
I think you just need to be very careful, as just mentioned, right? Basically it's difficult when people are wearing multiple hats and they all look the same color. So you have to be very disciplined to say, okay, so with the scientific advisory board, I'm holding this meeting now. This is the topic, and everything that comes out of here, keep very good minutes, keep very good records, and everything here is generated here. But that does not keep people from saying, oh, I just did this in my lab, and let's do this. And all of a sudden you have something that's probably a crossover, and you kind of just need to sort through that, right? So I think part of this is these folks, you love them because they're so creative and they're so incredibly good at connecting the dots and linking everything. But it's a bit of a nightmare sometimes from the IP perspective because everything, all the dots are connected. So I think, you know, you need to have a really good patent folks, and maybe, you know, a lot of times startup, the first lawyer they hire is a patent lawyer or is a person who actually understands patents, because, you know, someone really need to be able to parse through this and try to sort out, you know, which strand goes where and whether it's joined or sold. That's important. And the question as to when to set it up, I think a lot of times if you know, you don't set up the a scientific advisory until you have a real company, right? By that, I mean, you actually have money, have recognition, or, you know, but part of that scientific advisory board setup is also a bit of a validation. I think, you know, being in Silicon Valley, sometimes I look at startup companies, they say, oh, I have the chairman of the immunology department at Stanford as one of my scientific advisors. Okay, that's cool. It's validation, right? Because presumably that guy is so busy that he's not going to be a scientific advisor on multiple companies. Or if your technology comes out of a really prominent lab in, you know, in a Singapore university, and, you know, and that lab, you know, the folks in the lab are willing to be scientific advisors, or and so on and so forth, or you can recruit someone who is very well known in that field, that is a validation for the company. But, you know, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. You have to have, you know, you have to actually have the goods in order to recruit those folks.
Yeah, great. I think we might just move on to the next one. Apologies,
okay.
We might be running a little bit over time, but I think there's some great discussion. So I hope everyone can stay on for an additional 5 or 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, so okay, so this one is really much smaller fish, CDAs and MTAs, but you will find yourself use them a lot, because anytime you disclose some information that's proprietary, or anytime you transfer some material that's, you know, really proprietary, you want to use the CDA and the MTAs. The only thing I want to say here is I have a lot of startup clients who think CDAs and MTAs can be used in all different settings, and they actually use them in situations where you should never just use a CDA and MTA. And what I mean by that is you really need to be careful about about what new IP could be potentially generated. When you disclose something, it's one thing to disclose something to say, okay, I'm going to tell you my experiment results. Here, you take it, you go evaluate, and tell me if you want to do a deal or not. That's one thing. It's another thing is to say, hey, let me tell you all of my great idea about this experiment. Give me comments, give me feedback, tell me about it, right? Because in the first case, it's very passive. Someone received the information, they can evaluate it. That's the only thing they can do. In the second situation, you're generating new IP potentially by essentially collaborating in terms of conception of new IP. MTA is the same, materials. I transfer the materials to you, and you do some tests with it. You know, sometimes those tests are just fine. I put it into mice and see if they, you know, if the drug cures tumor. But sometimes you take under the MTA, I get to put it together with something else. I get to mix it. I get to, you know, co-administer it with something. Boom, new IP has been generated about combination use of your drug with something else in a particular setting or in a particular. And then what do you do, right? So the MTAs and CDAs are not equipped to do that. It's basically a bit of a handsaw, and you really can't use that to take out a tree. That's different type of agreement. So I think this is the type of thing that sometimes, a lot of times, we just need to talk about it and say, hey, maybe all we need is a beefed up MTA, or maybe all we need is to stick in a paragraph to say, if there's any IP, this is what we're gonna do. Or maybe what you think is an MTA is really a research collaboration, because guess what? I'm sending my antibodies to you, you're putting it in the mice, and then you are cutting out some samples and freeze them and sending them to me, and I'm doing some analysis and seeing, you know, what had happened in the mice after using my antibody, and we're going to pass materials and information back and forth. That's really a research collaboration. It's a mini research collaboration, but it's no longer an MTA, right? So I think we just need to be very careful about just because you transfer material, it's not necessarily just an MTA. Just because you're disclosing information, it's not necessarily just a CDA. I think that's the only thing I'm going to say about that. The rest is pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think we might just move on to the next few, in the interest of time as well.
Okay, service agreements. I think we already touched on this. These are the vendor agreements, right? You can't do everything. You go out, you engage a medchem shop, you engage, you know, some of the contract research organizations. You say, okay, you can run the mouse experiments. I don't have a vivarium, and therefore I send you the materials. You run all the mice experiments for me, so on and so forth. And service agreement, I think a hallmark of that, and which is different from SRA, is we almost always want to, you know, because it's fee for service, right? You're paying them the fees, all the deliverables and the IP that's generated and the materials generated will belong to you because you paid for the service. And the tricky bit is if the service provider has a platform technology sometimes, and they may incorporate that into the deliverable, you just want to have a license to be able to exploit the deliverable under that platform or background technology. And be very careful to tell the service provider, do not incorporate any third-party IP into my deliverable until we have talked about it, because you don't want to get a piece of deliverable, which, you know, in order to use it, you have to go to the third party and negotiate a license. The service providers typically don't have the right to publish. And then, you know, obviously the important thing is what's the scope of the service, what's the budget, because I think that's another big thing that comes up. Yeah, let's go to the next one. And there's kind of two things that you might end up using early on, but not at the very beginning, are manufacturing services and clinical trial services. These tend to be specialized agreements just because they have so many logistical and special kind of pieces. So they are typically not done using a template, just a typical master services agreement. In the manufacturing, I think we do separate out clinical supply versus commercial supply. If you think about it, clinical supply, you kind of know how much you need, right? You go into it with a clinical plan to say, okay, here's my protocol. I'm going to enroll 200 patients in 2 arms. I have 100 patients. This is the dose and whatever. You know what you need. You go in, you do a manufacturing campaign or 2, and you're done. With a commercial supply, you need a really sophisticated forecast and order system and so on and so forth, because you don't know, especially at the beginning of the launch, you really don't know how much you're going to need. So it's a more of an ongoing process. And you know, and I think typically the markup and the requirements and so forth is different. The clinical supply typically has a process development component to it, because whoever is making you clinical supply is also scaling up and helping you develop the manufacturing technology. But the commercial supply agreement typically don't have that. Obviously, there's a lot of regulation that's associated with it and so forth. Clinical trials, you hire CRO, clinical research organization. A lot of times, those are the folks who help you manage the clinical trial sites, especially as a big trial. If it's just a one-off trial, you don't need that, right? And then, so you have an agreement with a CRO. You may have agreement with someone who drafts your protocol. You may have agreement with someone who does your regulatory work, and that would be a consulting agreement or services agreement because they're service providers. And you have a clinical trial sites agreement. Those were with academic institutions, hospitals, and so forth. They all need to comply with the regulations and have special provisions for protocol adherence, adverse event reporting, ethical review, subject injury, informed consent. So that's why you can see why that's a different beast altogether. Patient privacy, you know, data usage. I didn't even list everything. So that's why you know, those tend to be more specialized agreements, and you know, we just handle them as they come in.
Yeah, makes sense. So there's a question that's come in that's quite interesting, which is you know, in the current pandemic, you know, how are these agreements affected in terms of their deliverables, and yeah, you know, do they need to have any amendments to be done?
Yeah. So there are 2 kinds of things, right? One is COVID-related agreements. One is non-COVID related agreements, but affected by COVID. The COVID-related agreements, the biggest difference, I guess, is everyone wants it done in a day because because it's urgent, and and so that's a bit of a challenge. And a lot of things are unknown, right? So I think, you know, in drafting those agreements, we tend to build in a lot of contingencies, and in some of these things we know what the path is going to be like, so we can negotiate all the terms. But with some of the COVID agreements, because it's so unknown, we're building the process. So instead of laying out, you know, everything about how we're going to make decisions and what we're going to do, we actually give the parties the rights to kind of figure it out as they go along. And then there are the agreements that are affected by COVID. I have a company who engaged this service provider to do a whole bunch of work, and they're just shut down. So it's a bit of a problem. And now they're reopened, but for a while they couldn't get up to speed. So, well, then people deal with it.
Right. Okay. So in terms of also, you know, with the evolving sort of new types of products that are coming out, such as cell therapy or gene therapy, you know, the manufacturing can be quite different. You know, do you see that the agreements are changing to adapt to these, or, you know, in terms of liability, or these kinds of terms, or more complex products?
You know, it's interesting because there are very few companies that are contract manufacturing for cell therapy. For anybody in small molecule, you have tons of CMOs, right? Even for biologics, you have a tons of CMOs who can do it. Some do a better job than others. But with cell therapy, I think a lot of it is because it's the cell differentiation, and a lot of the steps are actually the manufacturing of cell therapy is actually also the trade secret of how to create the cells you want. And that tends to make the biotech companies more protective about that technology, to not want to give away that technology to a CMO, and not wanted to go even outside. So the cell therapy companies are way more likely to set up their own shop for manufacturing very early on. And I have a couple of cell therapy companies. I mean, we negotiate agreement. That manufacturing technology is absolute secret, because when you add the interleukins and when you add certain things, when you differentiate the cells, how you sort them, how you can tell this one is going to be a winner and that one's going to be a loser. It's just it's very, very complicated. And that's actually the heart and soul of cell therapy. So that's all intertwined with manufacturing.
Great. Thanks for answering that. There's one audience question that's been upvoted as well. So I'll go through that. It asks, some civil law jurisdictions have the concept of moral rights, which limit the manner of the use of a work. How do you handle moral rights in a contract, especially under Singapore, UK, US law?
US law, UK law, we're not civil law jurisdiction. And actually, I'll ask my Singapore colleagues, is Singapore a civil law jurisdiction?
It's common law based.
It's common law based, thank goodness, because I stay away from civil law jurisdictions. So I think that as you know, whoever asked the question knows the answer, but for the folks who don't know, the difference between common law and civil law is, in common law jurisdiction, you write a contract, you negotiate the contract, and the contract is interpreted based on the words of the contract. But in civil law jurisdiction, the contract is interpreted in light of whatever statutes, rules, regulations, and law of that particular jurisdiction. So you thought you negotiated something, and if the code says something else, that actually trumps what you just negotiated. So in order to do that, in order to use governing law of a civil law jurisdiction, you really need to know the law and not just negotiate the contract and think what you agree to is what you agree to. On the moral rights and so forth, I typically just look for I think one place I can think of is Germany, right, or Switzerland, some European countries. I typically get a colleague or some experts to handle that, because there are people who are experts in that area, and I go get help from them because I can't keep up with what the best practice is in those areas.
Right.
Sorry, that's not the perfect answer, but I actually just not an expert on that.
I think I hope the question was answered quite well. So That's fine.
Thank you.
There's a question on MTAs and whether those can be used for transferring materials for demonstration purpose. So just evaluating tech for potential customers.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Well, okay, so here are two things, right? For demonstration purposes, if it is, I think so, but I think we probably will beef it up a little bit to say that you know, basically, because what do you do, right? If you use it on a person, typically MTA, I think about it is things that are in the preclinical setting. As long as you start using it on a human, if it's a product that's being tried on a human or it's a device and so on and so forth, for demonstration, we need to beef it up with product liability risks and injury risks and so on and so forth. And another demonstration purposes is for a pharma or for a device company to actually take your product and evaluate it to decide whether they want to buy the company or, you know, license the rights to the product or not. So those type of evaluation are happening more and more, even in the drug world. The pharma, you know, the companies wants to say, oh, the pharmas wants to say, okay, I want to play with your molecule a little bit before I take it. I would be very careful in those cases because you don't want them to take it and start engineering away from your product. So yeah, so I think in any kind of if it's a straightforward preclinical MTA with not a whole lot of IP that could potentially be generated and it's not going to be used in humans, use the MTA. If it's anything that's more fancy than that, talk to us.
That's great advice. In terms of, there's a final question which I'll ask from the Q&A, just to be wary of time, is more of a patent question, but in terms of, you know, drugs that are already available on the market, a lot of researchers tend to use them to study biological processes. And if they find that something, you know, works, is a blockbuster drug in their model, you know, can they patent that use, and how do they proceed with that?
You can always do a use patent. Yeah, so if it's a drug that's already on the market and you did an experiment and figure out a new use that there's no prior art on it and there's no prior filing, you can go file a patent application on that. Absolutely. And I have a client actually had to go out and negotiate a license on a use patent of its own drug because somebody else found that use. If the drug company who has the drug had already discovered it before, you're not going to be able to claim that because, you know, it's got prior art. And but if that drug company didn't know about that, and there's nothing wrong with you being able to derive some value for having figured out a use for their drug, right? Just know that the use patents usually don't fetch as much value as the composition of matter patents, and because and people only would need to license it if they intend to develop the drug in that use and commercialize the drug in that use as a label, as a labeled indication, right? Because if people just sell off market and they never promote it, it's really hard to pin down whether they are infringing patents or not. So they're limited utility, but it's not useless. And, you know, obviously you have to pay the patent cost to file the patent. So I think it's just worthwhile to talk to a patent lawyer and say, you know, how good you know, is this going to be, and how useful is it going to be? Is it worth it?
Makes sense. Great. Just as a final, maybe wrap up question, you know, thanks for presenting all of these different agreements. I think it's really great to see what types of agreements and when are they relevant for different types of companies. So amongst all of these, you know, when you're setting up a new company, which one is the most important, do you think, that you need to get right, and you need to perhaps, you know, get help to really make sure that the effects or the terms?
Probably the license. Yeah, probably the license. The in-license of your foundation technology is probably the single most important thing that you do.
Yep.
I don't know how many times when we get to a point where you're trying to partner the product or sell the company or go public, someone is doing diligence, right? Either the potential collaborator, the acquirer, the investor, the underwriters, and they look at this, they say, what does this actually mean, right? And then people have to go back and renegotiate or clarify. And that's the first agreement, is when you're in a rush, you don't have money to hire, you know, lawyers to do hours and hours and hours of work. You just want to get it down and check the box and move on. But that agreement will just come back for everything you do in your life. It's like your birth certificate. So you need to get that one right.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay,
Yeah, sure.
great. I think, you know, just in interest of time, thanks to all of our audience for staying with us.
Yeah, can I actually just say a word about, sorry, can I say a word about our Singapore office? We actually have 8 lawyers there. You know, 2 of the partners are actually on the call with me and a couple of associates. So I just want to actually say that, you know, I'm available to answer any questions, but we also have some folks on the ground there. You can see if you actually look at the folks, there's my partners, Matt and Farish, that are showing their faces. and yeah, and their bios are in the slides. I think we're gonna share these slides, so you're gonna be able to find them. They're right there. They're really the best emerging company lawyers that I've ever worked with. They, you know, help the companies get founded, get started, and get financed. They have VC connections, you name it. They are really your kind of thought partners in the whole process. And you know, they're just also some of the coolest people that I've ever worked with, and they're just very, very nice, and they always take your calls. So I just want to put in a plug for these folks who are on the phone, who are wonderful. When I'm sleeping, they're still working in your time zone, so feel free to reach out to them.
Thanks, Lila.
Great.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much to Lila, and also for everyone from Cooley for, you know, taking the time to be here with our audience, and for sharing all of your extremely valuable insights on legal agreements. I think, you know, the community, I'm sure, has really benefited from hearing about these different types of agreements. So I just really like to thank you guys for helping to organize this webinar as well. And to the audience, I thank you for your participation and your questions. We hope you enjoyed the session and found it valuable. And if you'd like to hear more about, you know, building partnerships and really growing these biotech companies, please do register for part 2 of this series, which is happening in just over a week on the 25th of August. So we will see you then, and wishing everyone a happy Friday afternoon and a great weekend ahead. So great. With that, I'd just like to close the session.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.